Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. My name is Rhiannan Price, and I am with a company called MaxR Technologies, formerly known as Digital Globe, but really an amalgamation of a few different companies. And we own and operate our own constellation of very high-resolution satellites. And we do a lot across space, across machine learning. But today, I am particularly excited to talk to you guys about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. How many of you are already familiar with the SDGs? Excellent, self-curated. How many of you are actively working on one or more of the SDGs? Fantastic, perfect. Well, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 very ambitious kind of global agenda guiding goals that the United Nations and their member countries adopted in 2015. And the idea is that they wanted to kind of guide the agenda for the next 15 years through 2030 with things like making sure we're on track to end poverty, ending hunger, reducing inequalities, improving our environmental sustainability. So there are these very ambitious global goals. But the beauty of this is that space-based technology can either directly or indirectly support every single one of these goals. Some of them are a little bit more obvious, so you'll see things like some of the life below water, life on land. There's a really obvious kind of space-based, particularly from satellite imagery, component application there. And then there are a lot of less obvious applications that I'm excited to talk about today too. Things that we're doing around particularly reducing inequalities, things around understanding education, around gender. You wouldn't think that you could do a lot of that from space with machine learning, but you really can. And just a quick introduction in terms of kind of MaxR's constellation and why it's particularly relevant for the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the constellation of satellites that we own and operate. They're electro-optical satellites imaging the Earth. And we launched our first satellite, IKONOS, in 1999. So that's the one all the way to the left there. And have been downlinking data ever since. So we have this really incredible repository of more decades worth of very high resolution data over the entire world. And we can continue to collect that as we add more sensors. You see our coverage and our revisit over these areas dramatically increases. But it's not just about resolution or coverage, it's also about the type of data that you're collecting. And so a lot of our sensors can also collect into kind of the infrared bands, right, or shortwave infrared. And that's really important because we can start to glean other things. So things that we can't see with the human eye, things like understanding soil moisture or understanding crop health, for instance. All of those things you can actually derive from space. And then last but not least, we also have as part of the kind of MaxR family, McDonnell Duttweiler and Associates, which operates RadarSat-2 out of Canada. And from a radar perspective, that's also really powerful, particularly for some of the environmental use cases that we'll talk about today. And I'll highlight that and how it's been a game changer in a lot of the countries that we work. So this, I wanted to give you guys a sense of how much information just MaxR is collecting across the world with our constellation. So this is just a snapshot here of the depth of our archive that we pulled earlier this year. So you can see all of these represent the kind of image depth that we have over a given area. And you can start to tease out where we image, because we're not just like, if you're familiar with Landsat or Sentinel, that are kind of more of a push broom approach that are kind of steadily imaging the globe on a regular cadence. Ours are a little bit more dynamic and agile. So we can actually task and point our constellation to image in areas where we think there's going to be more change. And so from this, you can start to actually kind of tease out where we think those areas are. So they're coastal areas, they're urban areas, and they're areas where our customers and clients have needs as well. And so we can be reactive to that and to support all of those use cases. And not only are we imaging the landmass, but more and more we're also imaging ocean areas. And so you'll see that in a lot of particularly the SDG on oceans, life underwater. We're able to use our extra capacity over those areas, over areas where traditionally there hasn't been as much demand for remote sensing. And we can apply that particularly for sustainable development. Now, why is this, one, such a game changer for global development and for sustainable development? It's because with the advent of cloud computing and with all of these big data sources and with artificial intelligence, we've seen a real paradigm shift. And it's gone from being in essentially a data scarce environment to a really data rich environment, right? We heard a lot of the speakers over the last few days talk about, we talk about big data, let's talk about small data. Let's talk about things that we can use, that we can put to make it meaningful for our everyday. We collect immense amounts of data, and it's not just in terms of a remote sensing perspective, right? So we collect 3 million plus square kilometers of imagery every day with just our constellation. There's many other satellite imagery providers out there, of course, but then you start to think about the other forms of big data, the social media data, the call detail records, and all of these are other sources that we're also trying to marry with satellite imagery and space-based technologies to actually unlock even further insight. But the reality of this is this data and the fact that we have access to it is actually exacerbating the digital divide, particularly in a lot of the areas where communities and a lot of the, particularly in the global south and more vulnerable communities, they don't have electricity, or they don't have access to broadband, or they just haven't had the capacity building yet to really unlock and take advantage of a lot of these technologies. And so the faster we move forward and the faster we progress, the faster that divide can widen if we're not thoughtful about it. And last but not least, I think around the kind of SDGs, really our legacy is, can we reduce that digital divide? Can we actually leapfrog using technology instead of creating more inequality? And so I think that's the question posed to us today, and the question we kind of have to ask ourselves between now and 2030 as we figure out how do we actually achieve and monitor and measure the SDGs, and space-based technologies and AI are going to be mission critical. So with that, I wanted to jump into what I'll call some of the more obvious use cases of space-based applications and AI. And one of those, I'll start with some of the work that we've been doing in terms of climate action, or SDG 13. So from a preparedness standpoint, we've been working with a group called Ramani Haria, which means open map in Swahili. And they're a group, it's a bunch of partners. So it's Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, it's the World Bank, it's the Red Cross. We're also involved as a data partner to actually take maps and take space-based technology and do what they call kind of a participatory mapping approach. So they can go in their communities, map all of their communities, areas where data have never existed before, and use that to increase their resiliency, particularly for flooding. And the idea is that Dar es Salaam, this area of Tanzania, is perennially flooded. And they know it's coming every year, and yet they're ill-prepared. And so they wanted to help make sure that, one, the communities had access to this data, but that the data existed and were being used locally. And so what you're seeing here is the incredible tech stack that the team is using, and it's kind of this beautiful low-tech meets high-tech approach where folks are printing off satellite imagery, taking it through the communities, socializing that with community members as well, and helping them kind of understand what they can do with these types of information. And it's really powerful. They've done really cool things too, where they've taken kind of tuk-tuks, if you're familiar in Tanzania, and made kind of like Google Street View cams out of them. They're using aerial imagery, they're using satellite imagery, and they're combing all of that together and then applying machine learning models to understand flood resiliency. But of course, that's more on the preparedness side. On the kind of response side, there's an immense amount of space-based technologies and value that AI can provide. This is just one example from some of the events that we've supported in the past, and this is from this is a flooded community in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. And so we have essentially a 24/7 team that's monitoring all of these areas and can actually kind of rapidly task our constellation to collect imagery over affected communities when big events like this happen. And so what we do is we can use pre-event imagery from our archive, because we're constantly collecting over areas. We can pull that most recent imagery that we have over this community in Houston, use that alongside the imagery like this that we've just collected over communities that are flooded, homes that have been damaged, areas that were affected, and then start to tease out things like what are the damaged structures, which roads are impassable, how do you get to folks, where do we need to focus in terms of deploying our resources and services. And you can see a lot of our partners on the ground, and Team Rubicon is one of the nonprofits that use our data and put it to use for disaster response specifically. They were using it to guide search and rescue missions for weeks during this, and we're just constantly imaging, constantly updating that data, pushing it out to them as actionable information that they can use and then go rescue folks from their home where they're needed. And so this is one example in terms of flooding, but we do a lot on other kind of hazards and other natural disasters as well. And I think this is where remote sensing and AI can do so much, because we know that these are only going to become more frequent and more intense in terms of these weather events in the years to come. And so from a remote sensing perspective, it really helps, one, to have information right away, but to be able to analyze it quickly, right? If you have a fire hose of pixels coming at you, there's not a lot you can do in an emergency setting unless you have an AI application against that to understand all those questions we just talked about. In this case, we're actually using our shortwave infrared imagery because it's all around wildfires. And so we've partnered with a group called World Resources Institute around their Global Forest Watch program to monitor forest fires in Indonesia and actually to kind of task in near real time teams that can go and mitigate these fires. And these fires are typically happening, they're illegal burning, more often than not for palm oil. And so we wanted to monitor, but if anybody is familiar with kind of remote sensing and satellite imagery, how this works is, this is a pretty cloudy area in Indonesia. And so a lot of times we'll get shots like this, right? Where they're obscured, they're hazy. You can't really derive a lot of information from this. And this is what we would call, this is what you could essentially see with the human eye, right? So our red, green, blue bands in the imagery. Now if we look at what we'll call a false color image, you can start to see different things. So this is stuff that we're starting to get into different wavelengths here. The red actually refers to healthy vegetation. And so we can start to see where it's healthy, but we don't have a lot of information around those other areas that we know are darker and maybe not so healthy right now. And we're also still seeing some of this smoke and some of the haze. What you're looking at now is actually a composite of the shortwave infrared and the near infrared information that's showing us essentially what we like to call a hot map. So this is the extent of the fire. This combination allows us to see through smoke and haze all the way, hundreds of kilometers above the earth to understand the extent of where the forest fire is burning and where it's burning most intensely as well. And if I can figure out this point, yes, I can. So you guys can actually see here in terms of these are the areas where it's burning most intensely. I'll do it on this side too so you guys can see here. So these areas, those represents the intensity of the fire. The green is the extent so far. And so the beauty of this project is this is really important evidence to have to make action, to make a decision. And so we've actually, with WRI, been able to work with the Indonesian government. Because of this project and because of this work, they've done things like ratify the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, which was a big win in terms of policy. And then they also created their own task force to respond to these in near real time, which they hadn't had before. So we can provide that feedback loop and make sure that these fires aren't burning uncontrolled. Shifting gears away from kind of the environmental use cases that have been traditionally applied to some of the maritime use cases. And you'll see a lot of this both in terms of the optical imagery that I mentioned, but also especially in terms of the radar imagery. And I'll talk more about that. But this, I think, is a really powerful story, actually from a few years ago in 2015, where we were approached by a reporter, an investigative journalist from the Associated Press called Martha Mendoza. And she and her team had been on the ground in several countries in Southeast Asia tracking an illegal fishing ring, essentially. And they knew that this illegal fishing was happening, and they also suspected that there was human trafficking, particularly labor trafficking, happening on these vessels, which, if you're familiar with what they call IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, then you know that tends to happen, right? That you'll have folks that are in essentially labor bondage that they put on these ships and forced to work. And so Martha and her team had information from talking to folks on the ground that there was this particular area called the Dogleg, which is not too far from Papua New Guinea, where a lot of these ships would actually engage in what they call transshipments. And so a transshipment is when, as you see here, one ship will actually hook onto another and offload their cargo onto it. And they do that because some of these ships will turn off their AIS transponders, their GPS transponders, so they can fish in areas where they shouldn't be fishing or fish for certain types of species that they shouldn't be catching. And so what they'll do is they'll those illegal vessels, or the ones that are engaging in that activity, will offload their catch onto a quote-unquote kind of authorized vessel to get it to port. And so this is really helpful in terms of having this type of evidence to show that illicit activity, or what we like to call kind of potential dark targets. And on this image, it's really incredible. You can actually see, on this image, it's really incredible because you can actually see where they have the cargo load open, where they're actually unloading those fish. And this is a 30 centimeter resolution image, so the highest that we can capture from space is pretty incredible. And we were actually really lucky to capture this. Martha and her team had incredible intelligence from those reports. We imaged this area fairly frequently, able to capture this image of the Silver C2 vessel. And because of this, the Thai authorities actually sent their Navy, intercepted this vessel, and then were able to free, as part of this and others, 2,000 fishermen who had been enslaved on those vessels as part of this IUU fishing ring. So it's just incredible story, and these are pictures of those people who were saved at the port, meeting their families, some of whom hadn't seen their families for 15 years. And Martha and her team actually won the Pulitzer for this work as well. So just incredible, incredible story. But it also made us think about what can we do at scale, right? So this is great, and we got lucky, to be fair. You talk about a needle in a haystack. The ocean's a big old place, and imaging it for vessels that are moving around is a tricky endeavor. So we started to think about how can we take what we've learned here and actually apply what technology has given us, apply artificial intelligence, apply remote sensing and the power of our entire constellation to address this issue. And what we realized is that we can actually analyze that AIS data, so that data that the ships are supposed to turn on, their beacons, essentially their GPS, while they're fishing, analyze that to understand fishing patterns and where anomalies are occurring. And so, for instance, when you're fishing for bigger species like tuna and others, you have a certain pattern with your vessel. And so we can actually look at the tracks of those vessels to see, are they fishing in a way that is indicative of the fish that they should be finding in this particular area of the world? One question. And that's sometimes can point to signal in this data, or if they turn it off. If we see gaps in the data and then we see them turning back on, that's also signal to us. And we can take what we like to call a tipping and queuing approach. So we can actually take the information from the AIS data and then task our satellite constellation to collect imagery over these areas. So rather than trying to just comb the whole area and see what we get, we can be far more specific and targeted in terms of where we're focusing those assets. And we first piloted this in 2017. We weren't sure what we were going to get out of that, but we were really successful, and we were able to capture a lot of those transshipments happening in process. So this is two examples from some of those transshipments that we were able to capture. We were working with a partner called SkyTruth, which is a great nonprofit out of DC. They did the AIS analysis for us. We did obviously the remote sensing side of it. And so we could take this data and then start to think about things like which vessels are risky vessels, and start to share that information with retailers. So there are tons of companies around the world that have signed on to, for instance, the tuna declaration and sustainability across their supply chains, and want to make sure that they have traceability in their supply chains to know where those fish are originating. And this is one way that we can do that. So it's really powerful, and we're starting to incorporate a lot of the radar-based technologies as well, because we can see through clouds with radar. And so the marrying of that with the optical, and the examples you're seeing here, is going to be much more powerful, and we're doing much more of that across the world. Another similar example from the kind of environmental side and really using the radar is a lot of the work that we do on forestry and deforestation. And this is an example of a palm oil plantation, and you can see kind of the road going into the plantation. And this is actually a protected area there on the left. And so what we're doing with radar is actually monitoring these areas on a regular cadence, because we can, and because we can see through clouds and things. This is just an example from an optical image over the same area, so you can get a sense of what it looks like and what palm oil looks like from space. And so we can start to actually, with that cadence of things, do what we call change detection, right? Or understand what's changing over time, where is it changing, and this is what that looks like. So this is another example from Indonesia as well. And so the green is the outline of a national park in Indonesia. The blue represents the Asia Pulp and Paper, so our customer, our client on this, their supplier concession. So that's the area that they specifically have to monitor, but they're also monitoring much farther areas because they want to improve their partnership with government authorities. And so with this, we can monitor that whole area for them and actually show what you're seeing in the red are those alerts around changes. So we know something's changed there. We don't know quite what it is yet. And so what we can do is use the radar to cue the optical. And so this is an example over one of those red areas from our electro-optical sensors where we collected, this is a 30-centimeter image as well from March. And so you can start to see this is an area that's been recently deforested. And so we can put a timestamp on that. We can tell you how much has been deforested, and we can also share that information. And we've been doing this work with Asia Pulp and Paper for a few years now. And over 3 years, they've been able to actually evidence that they're meeting their commitments to zero net deforestation. And that they've actually reduced tree cover loss throughout this area of Indonesia from 6% on average annually to down to 0.5%. So really incredible gains in terms of, one, what they've been able to do and the information that they have to make decisions on the ground, but also evidencing and monitoring that on a sustained basis. It's not always about just working with companies or working on huge areas. Again, I think this is a really neat example of talking about kind of low-tech meeting high-tech, right? So this is changing gears completely. We're in Brazil now and working with another partner of ours called Amazon Conservation Team. And they're also, just like APP, committed to helping realize net zero deforestation, particularly, and they have focus on protected areas and also working with indigenous communities throughout the Amazon. And so they'll work with those indigenous communities, just like in Ramani Haria, and actually help them use satellite imagery and use this data to make conservation planning decisions and actually have natural resource management plans that the community own, they create, and that they can enact against this. And so what you're seeing is our partner there, this is Brian Hetler from ACT, with huge old imagery kind of printed out, talking to folks about where their community is, where the river is, where they've been seeing changes in terms of what they're monitoring, and just changing the community's perspective in terms of, one, thinking very spatially in terms of broadening their perspective around their communities and their assets, but also really creating what I like to say is the next generation of geographers with the little guy there too. And then agriculture is another big area where we've done a lot of work, so SDG 2, which is around ending hunger. We do a lot in terms of applying ML on kind of your usual suspects, right, of understanding where crops are healthy. We do a lot in terms of like yield and productivity and extracting that. But we also do a lot when it comes to monitoring areas that are susceptible to food insecurity. And this is one of the examples from work that we've been doing with the Famine Early Warning System Network, FuseNet. In South Sudan in particular, we've been monitoring for several years now kind of displacement patterns in particular areas where we know it's either at risk of famine or conflict, recent conflict and instability is likely going to lead to food insecurity. And so what we do is we actually image this area because FuseNet, when folks are on the move, they don't know where those folks are going or how many folks are actually moving. And so what we can do is image this area and understand, one, are these just communities that have been there, so they're more permanent settlements, or are these more displaced populations? And what you're seeing here is actually an example of, these are internally displaced persons, or IDPs, in the middle of a marsh in South Sudan. And what they're doing is, these folks are actually going underwater during the day for their own safety and then only coming out in the evening time. So you can see they've taken their white tents from the UN refugee group, from UNHCR, they've taken them all the way into the middle of the swamp just for safety. But there's no way that they're going to be able to farm in this area. They don't have access to resources and services. And so without remote sensing and without the ability to find the needle in the haystack here, we couldn't help this community or this family. And the way that we've done that is we initially started with actually a crowdsourcing approach. And so first campaign we did was also in 2016 with them. And because South Sudan is a pastoralist society, we wanted to not only tag permanent structures and temporary structures, so those tents that I just showed, but we also wanted to tag herds of livestock because we knew that they wouldn't be on the move without all of their cows. And so what we did is we actually, in our crowdsourcing interface, and we actually did this as a public campaign. So FuseNet used it for advocacy purposes as well, which was fantastic. We asked the crowd to help us tag these 3 different features in the image. And we served up examples. So this is what cows look like from space. This is what permanent structures in this area of the world look like. This is what a temporary structure looks like. And we kind of guided them in terms of that. And so they were actually able to comb through tens of thousands of square kilometers in a matter of days, tagging all of these features and creating a really powerful output and these types of maps that are showing the displacement. So what you're seeing is a kind of color-coded output that's showing where the permanent structures are, where the temporary structures are, and those herds of cattle. And you can start to see, as we did snapshots over time, that those folks are very much moving southward and congregating in this particular area of unity. And so FuseNet could use that in conjunction with their partners, one, to rally more resources because they had a better idea, at least directionally speaking, of the extent of displacement, but they also knew where they needed to send teams to help support those folks as well. So this has been really powerful. It has also evolved into more of a machine learning approach because we can actually marry crowdsourcing with ML. One, crowdsourcing is, of course, the input to the training data that we need, albeit it gets us 80% there, and we need to do some cleaning and some refinement more often than not, but that's one way we use it. And then on the opposite is on the validation side, of course. So if and when we're applying machine learning algorithms to detect these features, if we want to further validate, we can serve those back up to the crowd and say, can you confirm that this is a herd of cattle? And we can start to get that confirmation. We can also, in our crowdsourcing platform, start to bake in kind of gamification, right? So more often than not, we're not just having one person check that particular feature. We're serving it up to a lot of different folks and understanding the consensus around that point. And we also track things in our crowdsourcing platform, for instance, around specific users, how long they've been contributing. So for instance, if you just signed up today, we might have your tags checked by a few different folks. But let's say you just signed up years ago and you've been a contributor and we know your tags are accurate, we'll readily accept that one and we won't serve it up again so we can be efficient in the process. So there's a lot of back-end QA, QC. And this data have been used by World Food Program, FuseNet, the UN, other UN agencies to really make a difference in South Sudan. And as we know, the insecurity there continues. So this is something that will continue with those partners. Shifting to some of what I'll call the less obvious applications. This is one of the projects that we've been doing working with our human trafficking partners. So it's around SDG 10 on the reducing inequalities. And if you're unfamiliar with kind of the scope of the human trafficking problem, our partners estimate that probably 40 million people thereabouts are actually in modern day slavery today. Vast majority of those are labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And we do things kind of differently depending on what we need and what kind of information we need to provide in the given instance. But this is one of the examples of an investigation we supported with a partner called International Justice Mission, where they were trying to essentially disrupt a human trafficking network that they knew was taking place. And so what they did is actually they used not only kind of satellite imagery and what they could derive out of satellite imagery, but also social media mining and other network analysis to understand where trafficking sites were likely taking place. And so what you're seeing here is they're combing social media. They know which the victims are because it's cyber sex trafficking. So they know who the victims are. They can correlate that with facial recognition in social media to understand where they're seeing the photos of those current victims. Then what they'll do is, what you're seeing here is analyze essentially the situation and the environment of that area and look at it vis-a-vis satellite imagery. And so with this, we were able to actually triangulate and say, based on this photo, we're seeing cell towers here. We can see where a cell tower is based on an off-nadir angle of satellite imagery. So what you're seeing is the overlay of this community. And we can start to triangulate those things, or using Google Street View as well as another really helpful source. And so start to triangulate to this very specific neighborhood in this community where we suspected that human trafficking was happening. And we could take that even farther to say, here's where we saw from the photo on such and such a day, here's where the cell tower is, here's where we think the house is where these girls are, and IJM, our partner, can actually use all of that information in conjunction with their partners in local law enforcement in country to ideally intercept and stop the human trafficking. And then this is just one example of many investigations that we've supported with this partner, where they were actually able to free 9 minors, some as young as 4 years old, out of this particular location. And they were also able to arrest 2 of the suspects there that were human traffickers. And out of this investigation, actually, they also arrested the number 6 wanted person wanted by Interpol. So it's just really incredible investigation. And again, using big data methods, using AI, and everything at our disposal to make what I like to call now small data inferences, right? Or very actual localized information that even local law enforcement feels comfortable acting upon. Another totally different example is what we've been doing with UNICEF around gender. So if you didn't think that we could do things for women from space, you're wrong. And I think this is one of the more creative approaches that we've been taking to understand actually the mobility of women and girls in urban areas. And so we started this in Santiago in Chile. And I think this is a great quote from Natasha Aldler from UNICEF around essentially the questions that we were asking ourselves, and some of this might seem obvious, but has never been analyzed or evidenced before. But we asked, would you, as a woman or as a girl in Santiago, would you walk down this street if it's too dark or too isolated? If you saw construction workers on the street, would you cross the road? We kind of informally know that these things happen, and we kind of know in our own cultures what it means, or in certain areas that we're traveling, but we haven't had data to confirm this, so it's just been a bias. What we've been doing is actually taking satellite imagery along with call detail records, from Telefonica in this instance, so when it's pinging cell phone towers, to actually analyze the patterns of mobility, and we can disaggregate that for women and girls. We can also disaggregate it for folks who are coming from lower socioeconomic households versus wealthier households, all sorts of things, and then marry that with the spatial data that we have, so we can actually understand where are they going. So this is one snapshot from the research where you can see some of the kind of essentially less equal. So what we found was that women and girls from lower socioeconomic households, their mobility was much more constrained. We didn't know exactly what that meant just by the mobility patterns from the CDRs, but we could at least tease that out. Then when we married it with the satellite imagery, we could understand that, yes, they're constrained, and they're constrained to areas where there's public transportation. And so what you're seeing actually here, so this is the mobility map, and then this is the map of those metro stops. Over here, you guys can see this is that metro stop that's running through this community, one of the busiest in Santiago. So we can start to understand things like this, and actually take these data and other inferences that we had out of this study and share that with city officials and really start to make more informed decisions around urban planning. Just, I think, one more example I've got for you guys, and then I'll open it up, see if there are any questions. And this is starting to talk about the scale at which I think artificial intelligence really unlocks a lot of the insight from the data that we work with. So this is a snapshot from a community in Tanzania again. This is in, I believe, Mara, Tanzania, actually. And this is around some of the work that we've been doing with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, actually, to essentially map really remote populations that in some cases have never been mapped before. And particularly important for them around their work in global health. You can't get a vaccine or a bed net to a household if you don't know it's there. And so many of these communities have never been mapped before, and as a result, they don't get the recognition in terms of the access and services that they need. And so what we can do is actually apply machine learning algorithms to extract the building footprints against this image. And so we did that in Tanzania. It was the first countrywide application that we did with the Gates Foundation. Slight change there, so now you guys can see the actual polygons on top of the imagery. And we did this with 95% accuracy, at least to the, I should say, to the imagery. We ground truthed this in country too, of course. But the great thing is we did all of Tanzania, and we're able to do it in a matter of 3 weeks. We mapped 18.5 million structures, and you're talking about thousands of images that we had to mosaic, essentially stitch together, make sure they were analyzable, run the algorithm, QA/QC the algorithm, and these are those results. So incredibly powerful in terms of just the scale at which we could deploy and the accuracy in which we could do it as well. And now moving forward, it's a matter of, okay, how big do we go, right? So far, Tanzania, as I mentioned, was our first. We've also partially mapped a number of communities, so you'll see those start to populate. These are areas where we have subsets of the country mapped, and this is primarily buildings and roads has been where we've focused. And then these are the countries that we've completely mapped, and we're adding more and more. And we've got some big announcements soon around this work, around mapping Africa, the entire continent in particular. So stay tuned for that in the weeks ahead. But I think this really underscores not only the potential, but the actual value of AI when it comes to the SDGs. And I think a lot of times we particularly those of us who kind of are part of the technology community, we talk about these big breakthroughs and we talk about the promise of technology, and more often than not, it's not realized for particularly the most vulnerable communities. And I think this is a beautiful example of where we're really focusing on more vulnerable areas that can use this data and can use it immediately. Just one last thought around the SDGs in terms of partnerships and kind of how we engage. And all of this work that I'm talking about today and anything when it comes to the SDGs is we're not going to be successful unless we're talking about partnerships. And this is just an example of some of the partners that we work with. And again, just a snapshot because there's a much bigger ecosystem. But these are the incredible partners, many of whom are risking their lives and their livelihoods to be in country and do some of this work. And other folks who are taking big bets on technology to move the needle for these communities too. So definitely want to give shout outs to these partners because we don't get to do what we do without them. And then last but not least, I'll close with a tagline that I steal from the Gates Foundation because I love this sentiment and I think we should all adopt it. It's this idea of being an impatient optimist. So I want to close with maybe a call to action of, especially for those of you who are working on the SDGs and for those of you who maybe aren't yet, let's be impatient optimists together. Let's partner together. Let's figure out how automation, machine learning, robotics, and space can all come together and really unlock a lot of what the SDGs need because the clock is ticking and 2030 is just around the corner. And with that, if you'd like to know more about any of our work across the SDGs, we have a fantastic ebook. It's available on the link there. So you can download that and see use cases and our partnerships, across all 17 goals. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions. So thank you, everybody. And I'll take any questions you have now.